Asturias, 1938. The land was grey with smoke, the air heavy with silence. Spain was at war with itself, and in the mountains of the north, every family measured survival by the day. Hunger dictated choices, not morality. In this harsh landscape lived two sisters whose decision would carve one of the strangest family stories Asturias had ever seen. They would share a husband. To outsiders, it might sound like a tale of scandal or lust, whispered behind church doors. But for the Calderón sisters, it was none of that. It was a pact born from necessity. The Spanish Civil War had drained villages of their men. Those who hadn't been killed on the battlefield were imprisoned, missing, or scattered in exile. Women outnumbered men, and many faced a lifetime of solitude, their futures chained to crumbling farms and empty homes. The Calderón sisters, raised in poverty and bound by blood, understood the math of survival better than most. They lived in a small stone house that had seen more winters than celebrations. Their mother, already hardened by widowhood, often told them that a woman alone was not a woman at all in those times. Marriage was more than love. It was protection, labor, and the continuation of a family line. Without it, everything slipped into ruin. One sister was quiet, practical, resigned to whatever fate awaited. She had hands calloused from work and eyes that had stopped expecting more than scraps. The other was restless, unwilling to surrender to despair. She craved stability, maybe even a touch of defiance against the hunger that shaped every decision. They were different in temperament, yet united in desperation. Then came the man. His name was spoken, then lost, swallowed by time and shame. But what mattered was what he represented. He was a survivor, one of the few men left standing, strong enough to work the land and provide a semblance of protection. For him, the arrangement was practical. Two women meant more labor, more children, more stability in a world that offered little of it. For them it meant not being left behind. It was not love that bound them but survival. The church would have called it sin. The neighbors whispered words like shamelessness, but hunger drowned out morality. And so the pact was sealed. One man, two wives, one household. Life inside their home became its own strange rhythm. The stone walls bore witness to both quiet cooperation and silent jealousy. Two sisters cooked at the same hearth, raised children side by side, and divided duties without fanfare. There were nights when the air felt heavy with unspoken tension, when jealousy lingered in glances, when the burden of sharing pressed against their pride. Yet they endured. They raised children, tilled the land, and kept the Calderón name alive. The first generation of children born under this arrangement knew no scandal. For them it was normal. They grew up with two mothers and one father, their relationships woven together in ways that blurred the lines of kinship, brother or cousin, aunt or second mother. The distinctions mattered less than survival. The war had already erased the luxuries of clarity. Villagers gossiped in hushed tones. Some judged, others shrugged, but most carried their own compromises. In times of scarcity, everyone bartered something: dignity, pride, tradition. The Calderón sisters simply bartered differently. Over time the whispers softened, replaced by a kind of weary acceptance. People might disapprove in words, but in their hearts, many understood. The arrangement became routine. The children grew. The land was worked. Seasons passed, and what had once seemed scandalous became simply the way things were. In the village memory, the Calderón household transformed into something between an oddity and a lesson. It was not celebrated, but neither was it forgotten. Yet what no one could predict was how their choice would ripple through generations. The children of the Calderón sisters grew up and sought partners within the same small community. Options were limited, outsiders rarely came, and Calderón blood began to mix with Calderón blood again and again. Cousins married cousins, nephews and nieces, crossed lines that in bigger places would have been unthinkable. The family tree bent inward, curling into itself like a spiral. Genealogists decades later would trace this pattern with astonishment. The Calderón name repeated across every branch. Marriage registers showed cycles of cousin marriages, entire generations bound in endogamy. What had started as a desperate choice in 1938 had become a legacy of insularity, a lineage so entangled that disentangling it was nearly impossible. But at the start, in that cold Asturian village, the sisters thought only of surviving another day. As the Calderón children grew into adulthood, the effects of their mother's choice became visible in ways subtle and profound. Their household was not just different, it was its own universe, insulated from the rules that guided other families. To them, kinship was fluid. Their father was the unifying figure, but the lines between mother, aunt, sibling, and cousin blurred until they no longer mattered. What mattered was belonging, and belonging meant being Calderón. In villages like theirs, the marriage pool was already small. Families lived close, sometimes no more than a few dozen households dotting the hillsides. Outsiders rarely wandered into such places, and when they did, they were not likely to stay. Marriage choices were limited, and for the Calderón descendants, the limits grew tighter still. Who could they marry? A neighbor? A cousin? The answer often became one and the same. By the 1950s, the Calderón lineage was already winding back onto itself. Cousins wed cousins, not out of obsession with purity, but out of practicality. Property stayed within the family, land was preserved, and the family name carried on. It wasn't spoken of as strategy, it was simply how things unfolded. Endogamy was the path of least resistance, the outcome of isolation, tradition, and circumstance blending into one. The church noticed, of course. Priests raised their voices in sermons, condemning the impropriety of two sisters sharing a husband, and the tangled unions that followed. But the church's influence had its limits. Faith could not put bread on the table, and in places where hunger pressed harder than guilt, survival spoke louder than sin. Families went to mass, crossed themselves, confessed quietly, and then went home to live as they had always done. Behind the gossip and the judgment, however, was a grudging respect. The Calderóns endured, while other families crumbled under the pressures of poverty, migration, or death. The Calderón bloodline persisted. Their unusual arrangement had created resilience. Two mothers meant shared labor, shared burdens, and children who never knew the weight of a household collapsing because one parent was lost. Neighbors might shake their heads, but they also saw the strength that came from such unity. Still, life inside the Calderón household was not without its fractures. The sisters, despite their pact, carried the silent strain of their unusual union. They shared not only a husband but also the inevitable comparisons. Who bore more children? Whose children thrived? Whose role in the household carried more weight? Their relationship was forged in survival, but survival rarely erases jealousy. Arguments were quiet, rarely exploding, but always simmering. The man at the center of it all wielded more authority than either sister, but in truth, the balance of power rested between the two women. Together they decided the rhythms of the home. The children carried that tension in subtle ways. Some aligned more closely with one mother, some with the other. Though they were all Calderóns, loyalties had shades. Yet despite the complexity, they grew up united by one thing: the family was inseparable. If the village pointed at them, they turned inward, becoming even more of a fortress against outside judgment. As the decades moved forward, the ripple effect widened. By the time the grandchildren of the Calderón sisters were born, the story of their shared husband was already legend. Some grandchildren heard it framed as shame, whispered in corners as if it were a family secret best forgotten. Others heard it told as a story of strength, proof that their grandmothers had chosen survival when the world offered no choices at all. Depending on who told it, the meaning shifted, and yet, the endogamy deepened. With every generation, the family tree folded inward. By the 1960s, Calderón cousins marrying Calderón cousins was no longer unusual but expected. Family gatherings became marriage markets of their own. where kinship ties bent until they nearly broke. To outsiders, it might have looked like a dangerous spiral. To those inside it felt natural. The name Calderón carried weight in the village. It was easier to marry within than to risk what lay outside. Historians who later studied rural Spain noted how common cousin marriage had been in small communities. But the Calderón case stood apart. Their lineage was not just occasionally endogamous, it was systematically so. Each generation doubled back into itself, producing records that fascinated genealogists decades later. Names repeated endlessly in church registers, bloodlines twisted so tightly that tracing them became an act of untangling a knot, rather than drawing a tree. The consequences of this insularity were complex. Some descendants showed signs of genetic fragility, illnesses or physical traits that might have been diluted in a wider marriage pool. Others surprisingly thrived, their resilience attributed to generations of adaptation to the same land, the same struggles. Endogamy was a double-edged sword. It preserved identity, but at a cost. Meanwhile, the sisters themselves grew old in the same stone house where it had all begun. Time softened their edges. Their pact, once whispered as scandal, became simply the story of their lives. They lived long enough to see their children grow into parents themselves, long enough to hear laughter of grandchildren echo against the same walls where their own jealousy had once lingered. They never became symbols in their own eyes. They were just women who had done what they had to do. Their legacy, however, had already taken on a life of its own. The Calderón sisters' choice was no longer just a family story. It was a pattern written into the very blood of their descendants. Their decision to share a husband had not only altered their own lives, but had reshaped the trajectory of an entire lineage. And still the whispers lingered. Even as the story passed from living memory into folklore, villagers debated its meaning. Was it sin or survival, scandal or courage? The answer depended on who you asked. By the 1970s, the Calderón lineage had become a story that outsiders found almost unbelievable. Villages across Asturias were changing. Young people were leaving, moving to cities like Oviedo, Gijón, or even abroad in search of work. Industrialization pulled men into mines and factories, women into domestic work, and families into apartment blocks that looked nothing like the stone houses of their childhood. But the Calderón family, anchored by its peculiar origin, resisted dispersion more than most. They stayed close to the land, to the village, and above all to themselves. Calderóns married Calderóns, generation after generation. For them the notion of marrying outside was both impractical and unnecessary. The land was inherited, the name was respected, and the family provided its own pool of partners. In such a tight circle, outsiders were rare additions. When a stranger did marry into the family, they were absorbed completely, their own identity swallowed into the larger Calderón network. By this time the original sisters were long gone, buried side by side in the village cemetery, their graves marked with simple crosses. Villagers who had once whispered scandal, now spoke of them as if they were mythic figures, women who had done something shocking but unforgettable. Their descendants, though, carried their story less like a myth, and more like an inheritance. To them the sisters were not figures of gossip, but the root of their tree. Inside the family, their story was told in fragments. Some branches of the family told it with pride. Our grandmothers were strong enough to bend the rules. Others told it with shame. They did what no good women should have done, but no one denied it. The truth was too ingrained, the evidence too visible in the twisted branches of the family tree. Marriage records from these decades show the strange density of the Calderón lineage. Priests who recorded the unions often scribbled notes of surprise, marking the closeness of kinship in their books. Yet they performed the marriages anyway. By then it was almost expected. The Calderóns were Calderóns, and that was that. Their identity was both their strength and their prison. This insularity created a kind of fortress mentality. The Calderón family became known as a clan that kept to itself, fiercely protective of its members, resistant to change. Their gatherings were large, noisy, filled with the overlapping conversations of cousins, who were also spouses, uncles,
who were also fathers-in-law, nieces, who were also daughters-in-law. Outsiders found it confusing, sometimes unsettling. For those inside it was simply family. Health, however, became a quiet shadow. Some children born in these later generations displayed health problems, subtle at first, then more noticeable. Doctors in nearby towns suspected the effects of too much intermarriage, but in the village, such talk was taboo. Families carried their burdens silently, unwilling to admit that their insularity might have a price. And yet, alongside these challenges, there were also Calderones who thrived, strong, resilient, rooted like the mountains around them. The paradox of endogamy revealed itself with every generation: fragility and strength, weakness and endurance, woven together. By now the Spanish state itself was changing. Franco's dictatorship still loomed, but society was shifting. Cities were growing, traditions eroding, and families like the Calderones seemed like relics of an older world. Still they persisted. Their stone houses stood, their fields were worked, their lineage doubled back into itself. In a world rushing toward modernity, they clung to the old ways, even if those ways had been born out of desperation decades earlier. Folklore began to absorb their story. In nearby villages, people spoke of Las Hermanas Calderón as if they were characters in a fable. Depending on the teller, they were either examples of sin or models of courage. Some said they had defied God, others said they had outsmarted hunger. Their tale became less about what actually happened, and more about what it represented: survival in the face of war, the bending of rules when rules no longer served, the strange resilience of families that refused to die. For their descendants, this shift into folklore was complicated. To be a Calderón was to carry both pride and stigma: pride in the strength of survival, stigma in the whispers of incest that followed the family's reputation. Some children grew up rejecting the story, distancing themselves from it when they moved to cities. Others embraced it, wearing it like a badge of identity. "We are Calderón," they would say, "and we survived." The village itself changed around them. Roads improved, electricity spread, schools expanded, but the Calderones remained marked by their insularity. Teachers sometimes noticed it in the classrooms: children who were cousins and also siblings, their family trees impossible to map without confusion. Local officials noted it in registries: surnames repeating endlessly, marriages looping back onto themselves. The Calderón case became quietly a fascination for those who studied rural demographics, and still the sisters remained at the center of it all. Though long dead, their choice to share a husband had become more than a survival tactic. It had become the defining origin myth of a lineage, a choice that echoed not just in the gossip of neighbors, but in the very DNA of generations. Even now, decades later, their story lingered in every Calderón child born, every Calderón wedding celebrated, every Calderón name written in the church's records. What had begun as a scandal in 1938 had grown into a legacy that no one could untangle, a legacy that blurred the line between shame and pride. By the 1980s, Spain was no longer the country it had been when the Calderón sisters made their pact. Franco was gone, democracy was taking root, and Asturias was modernizing. Roads brought cities closer, televisions brought new ideas, and schools introduced children to worlds far beyond their mountain valleys. Yet within the Calderón clan, the past still weighed heavily. The choice made in 1938 had left a mark that no amount of modernization could erase. Family reunions grew larger as the descendants multiplied. What had once been a single household had become dozens, then hundreds of interwoven branches, and yet the branches never spread far apart. Calderones married Calderones generation after generation, until outsiders joked that the family was less a tree and more a knot. To be born a Calderón meant inheriting not just a name but an entire identity. You belonged to the clan, whether you liked it or not. Young Calderones, however, were beginning to feel the strain of that inheritance. Some of them left for cities, determined to escape the web of cousin marriages and the suffocating insularity of the family. They found jobs in Oviedo or Madrid, took on spouses from outside, and started families with cleaner genealogical lines, but others stayed behind either by choice or by circumstance. For them the tradition of marrying within the family persisted, more out of habit than design. The result was a split, part of the Calderón lineage dispersing into the modern world, part of it curling back into itself as it always had. The stigma of the sisters' choice still lingered, though its meaning shifted over time. In earlier decades, people whispered scandal, as if their story proved some moral failure. By the 1980s, the story was retold with curiosity, even fascination. Historians came to study the Calderón case as a living example of how war and poverty could bend social structures. Journalists occasionally wrote about it, drawing both criticism and admiration from those who felt the family's history should either be forgotten or preserved. Inside the family, reactions remained divided. Some descendants refused to speak of it at all, embarrassed by the whispers of incest and impropriety. Others retold the story proudly, pointing to their grandmothers as examples of resilience. They did what they had to do, they would say. Without them none of us would exist. For every Calderón who carried shame, another carried pride. Meanwhile, the genealogical consequences continued to fascinate outsiders. Researchers traced the family lines, documenting marriages that tied first cousins together, sometimes even double cousins. Records showed how often the same surnames repeated, how limited the marriage pool truly was. To scholars, the Calderón lineage was a case study in rural endogamy. To the Calderóns themselves it was simply life. This duality, ordinary to those inside, extraordinary to those outside, defined the Calderón story. What had begun as an act of survival had become a symbol, a mirror reflecting both the resilience and the fragility of rural Spain. The family stood as proof of what happens when tradition collides with necessity, when hunger bends morality, when isolation seals choices that echo for decades. Some Calderón descendants carried physical reminders of this endogamy. Doctors noted certain recurring traits, illnesses or conditions that seemed unusually common in the family. In some cases the pattern was undeniable, in others it was dismissed as coincidence. But either way, the medical consequences became part of the law. The Calderóns were whispered about not just as a family with a strange origin, but as a family marked by its own bloodline. And yet, alongside these shadows there was undeniable strength. Calderóns were known for their endurance, for their ability to survive where others faltered. Their land was still theirs, their name still carried weight, their gatherings still drew dozens, even hundreds of relatives. The same insularity that created fragility also created resilience. Outsiders might pity or criticize, but the Calderóns themselves lived with a stubborn pride that few could shake. By this time the sisters themselves had become myth more than memory. Photographs, faded and cracked, showed them with stern faces and weary eyes. To the younger generations they were figures of legend, women who had dared to do something unthinkable, who had broken rules in order to save their family. Whether seen as heroes or as sinners, they remained unforgettable. The family cemetery became a symbol of this legacy. Calderón graves lined row after row, their names repeating endlessly. Walking through it felt like walking through the family tree itself, a maze of repeated surnames and tangled connections. Every stone told a piece of the story, every name linked back to the two sisters who had begun it all. As the 20th century drew to a close, the Calderón lineage stood at a crossroads. Some descendants embraced modernity, seeking lives far from the village, marrying outsiders, and leaving the old ways behind. Others held fast to tradition, keeping the family insular, repeating the same marriages that had defined them for generations. The legacy of the sisters still lived, not just in memory but in blood. What had once been scandal had become history. What had once been survival had become identity. The Calderón story was no longer just a family tale. It was a piece of Asturias itself, a reminder of how desperation can shape destiny, and how choices made in one desperate moment can ripple across a century. As the 21st century began, The Calderón legacy entered yet another phase. The village that had once been their entire universe was shrinking. Younger generations were drawn to cities, to universities, to opportunities that their grandparents could never have imagined. With them they carried both the burden and the pride of their family story. In the cities the Calderón name raised eyebrows less often. Nobody cared about cousins marrying cousins in a village far away. Yet for those who bore the name the history lingered in subtle ways. Some tried to bury it, never mentioning the sisters or the unusual household that started it all. Others brought it up openly, almost defiantly, as if daring anyone to question the choices their ancestors had made. Back in the village, the old pattern still persisted among those who stayed. The land was still divided among Calderóns, the fields still worked by familiar hands, and the cemetery still filled with repeating names. But the pressure of modernization was undeniable, with schools teaching new values and young people seeing new possibilities. The web of endogamy slowly began to loosen. Cousins who once would have married now looked elsewhere. Migration brought new blood into the family. Slowly, cautiously, the knot began to untangle, if only slightly. The story of the sisters, however, remained firmly alive. Local historians included it in their accounts of how war reshaped rural communities. Journalists wrote features about the Calderón case, portraying it as both scandalous and admirable. Anthropologists traced the lineage with fascination, mapping its patterns as if studying a rare specimen. The Calderóns became more than a family. They became a case study, an example of how human beings bend the rules of society to survive. For the descendants, this outside attention was both flattering and uncomfortable. Nobody wanted to feel like a curiosity, yet there was pride in being part of something unique. Family gatherings often reignited the debate. Was the sisters' choice something to be proud of or ashamed of? The answer never settled. It shifted from person to person, generation to generation. Some leaned on pride, others on denial, but none could escape it. As decades passed, the physical reminders of the sisters faded. The old stone house where they had lived eventually fell into disrepair, its walls crumbling under the weight of time. For some Calderóns it became a sacred ruin, a place to visit quietly, a reminder of where they had come from. For others it was a relic best forgotten, a scar in stone. Yet even as the building faded, the story endured in memory, told again and again at tables, in classrooms, in books. The Calderón lineage entered the new century with both scars and strength. Doctors still noted recurring health conditions in some branches of the family, a quiet reminder of generations of insularity. At the same time, other branches flourished, producing successful professionals, leaders and emigrants, who carried the Calderón name far beyond Asturias. The paradox remained, fragility and resilience intertwined. For those who looked back, the question always returned to 1938. What would have happened if the sisters had chosen differently? What if they had refused to share a husband, had tried instead to find their own separate paths? Perhaps the Calderón name would have died out, or perhaps it would have spread in a different way. The truth is unknowable. What is certain is that their choice shaped not only their own lives, but the destiny of hundreds of descendants. The sisters themselves never set out to make history. They sought only to survive, and yet their decision had written itself into the DNA of Asturias. Their names might not appear in grand history books, but in the oral histories of the region, they stood as symbols of what happens when ordinary people face extraordinary times. Even today, when descendants trace their family trees, they find the same looping branches, the same repeating names, the same echo of that pact made in desperation. They see in themselves the legacy of two women who bent the rules of society to ensure survival. Whether they view it with shame or with pride, it is theirs. It cannot be denied, cannot be erased. The Calderón story is not one of romance. It is not a tale of morality upheld. It is a story of endurance, of adaptation, of the raw choices people make when hunger leaves no room for rules. It is the story of how two sisters forgotten by history's spotlight
shaped generations with a single decision, and it is the story of how that decision, whispered in gossip, recorded in church books, and carried in bloodlines, still lives today. Their graves stand in silence now, side by side, simple crosses weathered by time, but the silence is deceptive. Their voices live on in the descendants who argue over their legacy, in the genealogists who trace their tangled lines, in the villagers who still retell their story. The Calderón Sisters are gone, but their choice remains, echoing across generations, a reminder that survival has its own kind of truth, one that outlasts scandal, outlasts scandal, outlasts scandal, outlasts shame, and outlasts even the war that forced them into it.